I was milling up some hickory yesterday and was pleasantly surprised when I found one board in the stack that looks like on the surface it had a little bit of curl to it. This is a rough sawn piece and you can see some curl in it, but you also see a lot of tear out. So I cut out a small section of this off, this board over here, to go through the milling process and see if I could get a nice surface without a lot of tear out. Luckily I was able to do so with a very slow pass at the jointer. And I don't know if you can see on camera, but right here we've got a lot of really nice curl to it. And on the other side, somewhat. There's still quite a bit of figure in here, but I think this piece would be a perfect candidate somewhere around in here for maybe a small sliding lid pencil box, something like that. So I'm going to use this and see what we can come up with. I'll start by using a hand plane to clean up one of the short faces. Not only will this give me a nice flat face for the rest of the milling process, but it'll also allow me to understand how this particular board is going to react with a hand plane. I think I'm going to make a pencil box, something that's about 7 inches by 3 inches roughly, and has a 3-inch height. So I'm going to cut that 3-inch height out of the board right now, and then I'll resaw that piece at the bandsaw to get all of my sides.
Hello.
Just to get the pieces down to the exact same thickness, I ran them through my planer with very shallow passes. This hickory, I know from experience, tears out horribly on this planer, especially with all of this curl. So I'm just feeding them one after another with just a slight advancement of the depth with each and every board. I went ahead and taped the two pieces together just to maintain grain orientation, just to make sure that everything lines up once again. And also, I don't need all of this board. I need to cut it to its final length, which is one short side plus one long side, and I'm thinking 11.5 inches should be fine, even with the curve cuts. So I need to avoid this chunk of tear out that I made last night, or yesterday here in the shop, and that's pretty much it on this side. On this side, there's a knot right here, which is pretty much unavoidable no matter which direction I come from. And then I also have this weird looking circle piece of the grain right here that I want to avoid. So I know that if I just say 2 fingers for this grain, this tear out right here, plus 11.5, that is less than the distance to this ugly spot. That's going to be good enough. I'll just cross cut right here and then add 11.5 inches. Anytime you put a board on end and resaw it, what you get is those inside faces becoming a book matched set. And anytime you have a book matched set, it is the closest you can get to having a mirror image side by side. Now, you know, take that with a grain of salt here. There's a lot going on with this grain. For example, this darker streak right here isn't really dark on this side, and this darker streak over here isn't really dark on this side. But the overall flow of the grain should be symmetrical, and you can see this, these two veins kind of get narrow right here, widen out right here, and then continue all the way up. So there is a lot of symmetry going on. And if you have a symmetrical edge up against each other and you rotate the pieces in, I guess, the opposite directions, then you have, once again, symmetry over here. Whatever this side is should be flip-flopped onto this side, a mirror image. And we can use that to our advantage with the box sides. So if I put this back together, and instead of just opening it up like a book, if I put one side by side, then I now have the matching faces on the outside. So the grain should wrap all the way around this. And to use that as our advantage, remember that a box has a short side, a long side, short side, and a long side. A rectangle does anyway. So what we can do is we can cut on this piece a long side, then a short side, continuing the grain around, cutting a long side, and then a short side. And then if we miter these together, then you should have a continuous matching grain all the way around. About 1.5 years ago, I did not know that, and thanks to some handy research and learning from other people, now I do. Because I already cut both of these pieces to the exact same length, all I have to do is cut the long side out of each one. Now remember, each one of the long sides needs to come from the opposite end of each board. So pretty much no matter what, if I don't follow a plan, I'm gonna do something out of order. If I just come to the shop and just build something on the fly and have fun, I always do something out of order. In this case, it's not the end of the world, but it would have been much better as far as consistency goes if I cut all of my grooves for the top panel and the bottom panel, well, lid and bottom panel, before separating all of my pieces. I can still cut it now, but it's just a timing thing or sequence thing. So I've got the blade set to 45 degrees right now. I'll go ahead and cut all of my miters and then go back to 90 degrees and cut those two grooves. All I want to do is establish a 45-degree angle. I don't want to reduce any length at all. So to help me do that, I'm going to use a stop block. Before making the miters, I made identical marks on this corner for each board and then on this corner for each board, so I know that these two pieces form a corner, these two pieces form a corner, all of the markings face up. That means there's only one way to assemble this, and it's like so. All of the miters turned out great, so now I can go ahead and cut the dados. Heartwood and hickory is more of a reddish brown color, and that's what all the box sides are made out of. And to contrast that, I'm making the top and bottom panel out of the sapwood and hickory. And sapwood and hickory it's kind of like this bright white color, and I made it just a little bit too thick for these grooves, and that's because I want to use a card scraper to clean these faces up and really get them down to size. Sizing the panel is very easy. The distance from right here to right here on the grooves is our width, and then from right here to right here is our length. Now, because the panel is so tiny and it is quarter sawn, so most of its expansion and contraction will be in the thickness, I'm not going to decrease the size of the panel at all for expansion and contraction. It'll be fine glued in place. Just as I thought might happen, the grooves weren't as consistent as I wanted, so I did have to finesse both the top and bottom panels here and there to get them to be absolutely perfect. That's okay though. I did get everything lined up, all the miters look good, and each one of the panels has a little piece of blue tape to designate its exact orientation. So everything looks good. I'm going to take it apart, use some blue painter's tape as clamps, and glue this thing together. This is a very easy and uneventful glue up, so long as you check all your boxes, no pun intended, before you before you do the glue up. Distracted. Oh yes. So these are relatively thin sides. They're not that big, and it is really chilly here in the shop, so I'm going to let this sit overnight and let the glue just do what it wants to do and fully cure before I stress the joints any further. It is the next day. All of the joints look really good, and now on to the part of the project that I'm actually really looking forward to, and that is to make some really tiny splines to reinforce the corners and add a little bit of visual interest. This is a scrap piece of wood that I was experimenting with to try and make extremely tiny kerf cuts and therefore tiny splines. So the distance between these two over here is about 1/8 of an inch, which is the distance or the thickness of my table saw blade. So if I was to cut this kerf cut or this spline cut on my table saw, I would be forced to have a really wide spline there. I could use a thinner blade, but you can't go that thin. Not this thin anyway. These were made with one of these Japanese pull saws, a very thin blade. And I want to use this size spline on the box. However, the colors are going to be reversed. My box, it has a darker color for the body and a lighter lid, so I'm going to use lighter splines, and hopefully they'll stand out. There are a couple advantages of using a table saw to make splines, and that is basically due to the fact that you have to use a jig on the table saw. You have to have some way to hold the piece as you push it through. You can't just freehand this. So with a spline jig on the table saw, you have basically two reference planes. Number one, you're going to reference the side of the box up against the fence of the jig or the fence of the saw, and that will position the spline left and right. And then also you're going to have a reference face off of one of the sides of the box to determine that 45-degree angle. So with that, you'll have pretty much consistent results all the way around. Every one of your splines will look the same so long as you use the exact same setup for every one of the cuts. We don't have a jig, or I don't have a jig for the handsaw, so I'm just freehanding these, and instead of creating a jig, it's just going to be a lot easier to make some reference marks and then just stop at those marks. To establish the depth of cut, I made a mark 1/2 of an inch in from each edge and then extended that line all the way across the entire face. To establish not only the location of each one of the splines, but also give me something to visually track as I cut the splines, I'm using a marking gauge set at about 3/16 of an inch. Unlike most other times where you use a pencil for layout, here we want to divide the line in half, split it right down the middle, rather than leaving it on one side or the other. So the goal is to try and be as consistent as possible with the cutting angle and get down to the reference lines at the same time on both sides. If we cut a little bit like this, we're going to have down to the cut line on my side, and we cut like this, we'll be down to the cut line on the opposite side, and therefore we're leaving a little bit of a hump in the middle. So consistent, longer strokes. Alright, I don't need a lot of material here for the splines, but I do want them to be somewhat consistent in thickness. So I've cleaned up one of these short edges of this sapwood board with my jack plane, and now I've got my number 7 set really aggressive, way more aggressive than what I would ever use it in any normal operation. So what I'll do is, wow, it's aggressive enough that this is rocking back and forth quite a bit. Anyway, I'll start the cut, maybe, if I can, through this hickory, break this off. Ooh, stay in the groove. All right, break it off and test it in the kerf. It's still, that's a little thin. I'll advance the iron just a little bit and try and push this thing a little bit further. Whew. Break it off and test it in the kerf. I think that's it. Alright, I think that's a perfect fit. This is probably enough, but I want to have a little bit more for reassurance here. So, just to finish the cut maybe. Man, that's ridiculous. Okay, this is plenty enough kerf material for what I need. A little bit of glue on the spline, and I want to work fast here because this glue will make the wood expand, which is not what I want. I don't want this spline to be any thicker than what it is because it's already delicate. And now I can start on one side and kind of hopefully pull my way through and use the glue somewhat like a lubricant before it starts to set up, if possible. And oh, that's a delicate process. Can't tell if I'm all the way down on this side. I think I am. Yeah, so now we will remove the excess glue from both sides. Trying to move quick. And then use a chisel with a paring cut to, let's see, I gotta do this left-handed. Chisel with a paring cut to slice that side off, and then slice, oh man, this is odd left-handed. Slice this off. And there we go. Not too shabby. I only used 2 splines per edge for a total of 8 of them, and they look really nice, but I didn't want to go crazy with them and really distract from the wood grain here, so just 2 per edge, that's all I'm going to do. Now I need to separate the top from the bottom, or the lid from the body of the box, and I think it would make most sense if we try and make a kerf cut at the table saw to slice this knot right in half and hopefully remove as much of this darker spot as possible. To make this process just a little bit safer at the table saw, I like to set the blade so that it does not cut all the way through the material for the short faces, and then I'll raise the blade just a little bit so that it does cut all the way through, and then cut the long faces of the box. That way a shoulder or the cut line is established all the way around, but the pieces aren't being separated just yet. I don't want them to separate as they move through the table saw, so then I can take the box to the workbench and safely continue the cut or complete the cut with a handsaw. Because the grain is going all the way around the box, that means the cutting direction is going to go all the way around the box on the top, as far as clockwise or counterclockwise. And that means to get a nice smooth surface all the way around and verify that we don't have any little minor high spots, we can use a smoothing plane to very carefully go all the way around and make sure there are no high spots. I'll do the same thing on the lid real quick. For the interior lining, I'm using curly maple. I just need to cut these pieces to an appropriate length, a little bit oversized, and then sneak up on an exact fit with my shooting board, making a 45-degree miter. Not only does this interior liner brighten up the inside of the box and maybe make it feel a little bit less small, it also provides a registration point for the lid so it can close nice and even all the way around. For surface prep, all I'm using is a scraper, and I'll use that on all of the exposed faces, and then I'll use a simple top coat to bring out the beauty of the wood.